If you're like me, you grew up far away from any major American city. Your only conception of these places was formed and shaped by the media you consumed. LA is the place where movie stars and actors live. Sure, there are a few less than safe places, but as long as you don't anger the colorful gangs, you should be fine. New York is the concrete jungle where dreams are made of. The skyline is the envy of the world, and the Statue of Liberty is a beacon of freedom amidst a sea of global tyranny. Of course, I wasn't so naive as to fully buy into these conceptions. Still, I'd be lying if I said I didn't severely underestimate the level of crime, homelessness, and dilapidated infrastructure in these cities. Over the past few years, I have visited many of these cities for the first time in my life. In doing so, I was confronted with the ugly, embarrassing reality of them. Most recently, I found myself for the first time in cities like Philadelphia, New York City, Chicago, and DC. I set out to see the law schools to which I had been admitted. These schools are amongst the best in the country and the world, so naturally I had high expectations. However, upon arriving, I couldn't help but feel visceral disgust as I passed by the areas surrounding these schools. Some of the smartest students in our country are forced to live amongst crime, instability, and utter destitution, and why? Why are the cities in the country that prides itself as the very best so horrible? Why does the smell of weed engulf you as you walk through a Ben Franklin museum? Why can't we have nice things? Our country, despite its youth, has a remarkably beautiful history. I couldn't help but feel inspired as I walked through the Ben Franklin Museum. He founded the very school I was visiting on that trip. He was a prolific reader. He dedicated his life to the pursuit of knowledge, sociality, and to bettering his country. He was everything one could hope for in a fellow countryman. Our history is littered with people like this, great men and women who have lived and died for the country that we have today. The institutions that were set up during the founding have proven incontrovertibly resilient and prescient. However, clearly something happened along the way that took us from the Philadelphia that Ben knew and loved to the Philadelphia that I saw. There are a myriad of reasons, both particular and general, that contribute to the current status of American cities. But in this video, I want to hone in on one general thesis that I believe explains a large part of the problem. That thesis is as follows. Misguided attempts to correct historical wrongdoings have led to changes in the makeup of our decision makers, as well as to changes in the ways that we can and do react to issues in society. There is no avoiding the fact that our history, like all histories, is littered with brutality, wrongdoing, and injustice in all shapes and forms. From the initial enslavement of the African peoples to the barring of women from most positions, we have done wrong. However, in a nobly minded attempt to correct these wrongs, we went too far in the other direction. We moved away from mostly merit-based systems to systems centered on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We made purposeful attempts to change the makeup of our legislatures, private firms, and media to represent the people descriptively. The issue with this approach is that we did this before we attempted to equalize the groups in terms of merit. When you have a group that has been excluded from educational institutions, from public discourse, and from many aspects of life generally, then it is unlikely that that group will be on the same level as the dominant group that enjoys the privileges of full citizenship. So when you force their entrance into decision-making roles, you almost necessarily lower the quality of our decision makers. We attempted as a society to fix a problem that had been going on for centuries, in a matter of decades. This is not to say that there were not members of the non-dominant groups who were capable of decision-making. They certainly existed, and insofar as they did, those would and should have risen through the ranks of a thoroughly merit-based system. However, there would have been disparities. This is what we have fought so hard to avoid, and this has been to our detriment. The reality is that disparities exist everywhere in life. Simply look at professional sports and see that in our last truly merit-based system, there are disparities in race, height, and ability. Nevertheless, we accept this because we want the best sports teams. So why don't we want the best government? The makeup of our decision makers matters for more reasons than sheer ability. In political science, we use the terms descriptive and substantive representation. Descriptive representation is when your body reflects the population in terms of the proportion of peoples. So if you have 10% black people and 90% white people, a descriptively representative body would have 10% black people and 90% white people. Substantive representation is when the government represents the issues of its constituents. So if you have black legislators, they are substantively representative of black Americans if they push for black issues. Now, findings in political science repeatedly show that descriptive representation leads to substantive representation. What this means is that black legislators are more likely to look out for black people. Female legislators are more likely to look out for women. I argue that this connection between descriptive and substantive representation explains many of the issues that we have today. This quality, the tendency to look out for one's own where it exists, is antithetical to what a good ruler or decision maker does. The good of the whole should always be prioritized. Anyone familiar with Plato understands that the good of the whole should supersede the good of the few. Let's take an example to understand how this tendency to look out for one's own might conflict with the tendency to what's best for society at large. Imagine a black legislator who looks at the issue of criminality and homelessness in a city. What is he more likely to see? Will he see a group of people who are antisocial? A group of people who actively hurt the city? The answer is most likely no. The reason has to do with racial disparities in crime. I'm not here to make an essentialist argument because the truth is I am not a racial essentialist. I do not believe that certain groups of people are forever destined to be criminals. However, I can read basic statistics, and I do understand that a disproportionate percentage of the criminals and homeless in major cities are black. Because of this, a black legislator, as demonstrated by the literature, is more likely to tie these issues of criminality and homelessness with the issues of race. He will demand that the schools in black areas are improved, which of course means injections of cash. He will push for social programs to improve the communities. He will not stop for a second to consider whether the more appropriate move would be to remove criminals regardless of their race from society. He will not stop and think about the disproportionate rate of mental illness amongst the homeless. The Chinese solutions to homelessness will be completely off of the table, all because of an illogical racial bias towards one's own. My point here is that this issue of criminality and homelessness, an issue that should be divorced from race, inevitably becomes wholly about race. A proxy racial war, if you will. Because of this tendency for descriptive representation to lead to substantive representation. Someone divorced from their racial tribalism can look at the issue and say, logically, we need to crack down on crime. We need to fix homelessness, even if that means removing people with severe mental illnesses from society. We need to clean up our cities. As I mentioned earlier, I am not a racial essentialist. Because of this, I think that we can dispel the racial loyalty that is more pervasive in minorities. If we want to have a good society, this is something we must do. Either society will split into racial sects and race wars will become inevitable, or we will transcend race itself. There is no third option. Without this transcendence, every issue will inevitably become bound up with race. There is a historical parallel here. The religious wars of old Europe dealt with the same issue. Divides in religion led to conflict after conflict. Philosophers like Locke vacillated between ideas of forced conformity and acceptance of diverse beliefs. This is akin to those who vie for either racial homogeneity or diversity. In the end, philosophers like Locke came to see that the forced conformity of religion on a population was impossible. Similarly, forced racial homogeneity in a diverse population is impossible. The good news, however, is that we no longer have wars between Protestants and Catholics. That came about because we separated church and state. We openly advocated for religious tolerance. In the same way, we must advocate for racial tolerance and a separation of race and governance. If we cannot divorce the color of our skin or our sex from our decision-making, we will fall apart as a country. I want to pull on Plato a bit here to stress the importance of governing for the good. As people, we have a tendency to operate mostly on emotion, on tribal loyalty, and on selfishness. This is ultimately why Plato prescribed a philosopher king. The key distinction of this philosopher king was that they could discern the divine, the thing that is ultimately best for society, and they could act in accordance with this thing. They lacked autonomy in this sense. They were completely subservient to the form of the good. They were to mediate between the divine and the profane, attempting all the while to impose the good onto their society. Plato understood that there had to be things done that weren't pretty for society to be better off as a whole. For example, Plato advocated for the forced removal of the criminally insane from society. The last thing that I want to elucidate here is that changes in the makeup of our decision makers have also led to changes in what we can do in response to crime. The introduction of women into politics and broader society has undeniably led to a growth in concern for criminals and the homeless. On some level, it is good that they have caused us to question the factors in the lives of criminals that contributed to their becoming. On another level, it ignores the fact that some people are irredeemably bad, and they always would have been regardless of the way things are. It is nice to think in theory about the ways that we can improve our institutions. It's even nicer to be able to walk through New York City subways without being pushed onto the tracks. As a society, we have been told that it is our fault that people who commit crime, people who degrade our quality of life, do what they do. That is absurd. It is time that we stop acquiescing to this notion. It is time that we stop being patient to those who ruin the work of centuries of Americans. Some people are simply not fit to participate in society. This is something that nearly every other country accepts. Let's explore the differences in some other countries to elucidate this fact. Everyone has heard of El Salvador and Bukele's crackdown on crime. After calling for a state of emergency, Bukele mobilized political and police power to wage a full-on war against criminals. Bukele arrested and imprisoned all suspected of being engaged with the gangs that ravaged the country. Non-El Salvadorians lamented the abuses of human rights as the country for the first time became safe for the natives. Quoting an article, in 2015, El Salvador had 6,656 homicides, making it one of the world's deadliest countries. In 2023, there were 214 homicides. And here we have another example of why we cannot do the things necessary to clean up society. We are paralyzed by concern for those who display no concern for us. In the end, the output of this concern is what we see today, tent cities in a society full of people that blame everything wrong with their lives on institutions and on those who existed before them. El Salvador provided a perfect example of the benefits of a harsh crackdown on crime. It is time that we push for the same. No one should be afraid of taking public transport in their country. China has much lower crime than the United States across nearly all metrics. They also have far fewer homeless people. This has to do with the authoritarian bent of China. Many Americans decry the invasiveness of this surveillance state as if we aren't surveilled as well. Yet our surveillance doesn't involve the stopping of criminals. Generally, it just involves scraping data to sell things to consumers. The reality is we could learn something from a state like China. Their urban areas are littered with cameras, and their collectivist mindset makes concerns for the whole far more possible than our individualist culture does. China represents our largest competitor globally, and recently has become abundantly clear to many Americans just how prosperous much of China is. Their ability to compete has become so clear that many of their products are banned from entering into our country. Granted, the same is true of China and American products. However, the irony becomes obvious when we are ostensibly the land of the free and the lovers of capitalistic markets. As a country, China is among the countries with the lowest rates of crime and gun-related cases. But it can't be related to their harsh criminal policies and tendency towards surveillance and authority. That's, of course, not possible. So how can we fix this? Well, let's look at a more familiar example to figure out what we must do. Take yourself back to the second grade. You're sitting in class as those kids who always act out are causing a scene. The teacher is completely unable to gain control of the situation, and the male teacher next door comes into the classroom. He sees a scene of unruly kids unwilling to acquiesce to the demands of civilized classroom life. What does he do? Does he speak softly about the institutional and familial factors that led to those kids being the way they are? Of course not. He slaps the ruler against the board and yells for the students to quiet down. He uses authority. Naturally, most acquiesce as authority engenders a response. However, there are often those kids who continually act up. What happens with them? They are sent away to the office or they are expelled. So why are we so obviously aware of how to fix a classroom full of unruly kids, but so completely ignorant as to how to fix our society? As I've made the case throughout this video, it has to do with the people making decisions. This is what we need to fix. We need to push the transcendence of race and gender as a society. Those who cling to their race and sex need to be shamed. The good of the society as a whole must finally be stressed, as Plato said over 2,000 years ago. We must undergo the transformation that our ancestors did to accommodate religious diversity today. The only other alternative is prolonged and continued racial and sex-based conflict. As is done in China, we must continually look towards and work towards that ideal community. We must be willing to do the things that are necessary to have a good life. We need to clean up our cities. We need to lock away criminals. We need to find something to do with the mentally ill who call our streets their home. Finally, we need to end every single DEI policy that exists and replace it with a simple merit-based system that reinstates the best of the best in the positions that matter. These are the people most likely to be able to transcend mere physical characteristics. As Plato says, these are those who can best mediate between the good and society. There may be disparities, but those disparities only matter to those who cannot see beyond their physical selves. I want to add in one final note to those who claim that certain races of peoples are destined to be the way they are. These people may argue that the things were better off 50 or 100 years ago not because of the more merit-based system, but rather because of the fact that white men made these decisions. To these people I say this: when one group holds power and they give it up to someone else, who is to blame? The decision makers so lauded by these race-obsessed individuals are the ones who first moved us towards these systems of DEI. People may say that subterfuge was at play. If this is the case, then would reinstating those who were vulnerable to subterfuge be the proper move to prevent the same things from reoccurring? The reality is, when something does not work, the proper move is to not go back and try it again, but to devise a new system. For the first time in American history, we need to fulfill the dreams of the framers. We need to devise and implement a system of pure merit, blind to the particularities of those abled individuals who are best able to guide us as a nation. The race-obsessed individuals who plague the right are no better than those of the left. We will never move forward as a nation if we cannot transcend mere matter.